Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Tuesday Tips. As always, I'm Michael Barber from Grow Schools, your host of our Grow Schools channel here on YouTube or LinkedIn, wherever you might find yourself watching. Welcome back to episode number 52 of Tuesday Tips. If you are familiar with our channel, you know we're here usually every Tuesday tackling the biggest challenges facing school leaders. And this week, we've got a brand new guest, Dr. Paul Miller, the CEO of Rochester Charter Champions. Dr. Miller, it's so good to have you on the channel. Thanks for making the time for us.
Thanks for allowing me to be here.
We appreciate it. Dr. Miller has just an extensive background in working with school leaders all over the country, particularly in the Rochester area. But we got the chance to get to know him at the national conference this year. He sat in on a panel that our team and a few other panelists were on. So we asked him to come back to provide some perspectives on a couple of challenges that school leaders are, of course, facing. So we'll hop right into our questions. As usual with Tuesday Tips, we try and keep these conversations to about 10 to 15 minutes, but Dr. Miller, I know we'll have a lot to talk about, so we might go a bit over today, but we'll start with question one. Dr. Miller, you've worked with a ton of schools and school leaders. What advice would you give to them who are navigating these ongoing financial pressures while still providing their teachers the tools and trainings that they need to succeed in the classroom, especially as we think of, post-ESSERS and the additional funding that school leaders have been getting for so many years as we've headed through this, post-pandemic period?
Right. So I think we need to break the question up if possible. So I think the first part is looking at the financial pressures, and with the financial pressures, breaking it up and looking at how do you build a unique brand for your school where your brand sticks out and you're able to sell your brand better than anyone else, and build that brand. But your brand has to be immersed and rooted in some foundational aspects of success and in results, or working towards it to be able to get people to buy into it. So building that will help with financials. But even within that, part of it is making sure you have the right systems in place for recruitment, enrollment, big on making sure that you're running the school as a business. So the kids are always going to be the priority. Teachers are always going to be the heartbeat of the school. However, your school needs to be ran like a business. So if you are an educational leader, especially in the charter world, sometimes we get thrown as the CEO as well as the principal. And when you're that CEO or Super Nintendo, right, you have more obligation than just the academics. You have to be astute at the business as well, which that wasn't, most of us weren't classically trained in that. So my advice to you is get somebody who is. You don't have to know everything. You don't have to do it all. I always love to have people that are smarter than me around me. Build a team, build people around you that can do that work, whether it's finance and operations, and build that team so that you're not doing things that you really don't know how to do. Because when you don't know how to do them, you're going to come up short financially. And so finance and budget are almost equally as important as academics, because the school can't run if you don't have any money. So just thinking about as far as the classrooms and teachers, and that's a whole nother aspect of the question. And I think you have to be doing all of these things in conjunction. And so as the leader, my main goal would tell leaders to build a culture of CTE, collective teacher efficacy. And so if the research says, John Hattie says, that collective teacher efficacy moves the needle more than anything, any finance, any other buildings, any other pieces. You build a culture of teachers that are so tight knit together in a culture of the school where they're successful, where they're holding each other responsible and accountable and holding you responsible and accountable for success. But it's about what type of culture the leader is going to create. And that starts with training, but it starts with bringing them into the collaboration parts and being a transformative leader who makes it a part of what they do on a daily basis.
Yeah, it's interesting to see, or should I say see? I should say here. You talk specifically about running a school like a business. It feels like that perspective is gaining a lot of momentum as of late, particularly as we look at what are going to be likely challenging budget environments, depending upon which, location you are in the country, demographic shifts, et cetera. There was a great article this week from a team in Ohio, the Springfield, Ohio districts on Ed Week, talking about running a school more like a business. So it seems like that perspective is certainly one that's bubbling up in the conversations in across education more than it ever has done before. I wanted to ask specifically, as you talked a lot about brand, enrollment, marketing, and retention, just things that are incredibly important for schools and their school leaders to help differentiate their schools. But enrollment trends are shifting, across the board as we look at people moving across the country, drops in enrollment, particularly in elementary level education as, birth rates decline. What do you think some of the biggest challenges are that school leaders face in today's enrollment landscape, and how can they, potentially address them or impact them?
I think there's a lot of the challenges have been very poignant since after COVID. And I think a lot of our communities have realized that there's other options for school. So there's a bunch of different options. We have homeschool, there's private school, there's traditional district schools, there's charter schools, there's probably other things that I'm not even thinking about. And with all of those other options, it gives people more choice. But that's what really charter schools were developed for, was to be able to provide a choice. And so, for me, I'm a straight shooter. So I'm going to tell you, how do you make it so your choice is better than anybody else's? If your choice is attractive and your choice is better than anybody else's, and you offer what a child and family needs, that's how you defend against that. You make sure that you're programming and that you're getting results. You make sure that you have all the systems, that you're proactive, you're putting things in place instead of being reactive to, oh, okay, this family's leaving because of this. No, how about I want to make this place the best, happiest place possible for kids, and make sure that adults are successful here too, as much as I want kids to be successful. Because part of the difficulty is that there's a huge gap in the educator pipeline. And so teachers are leaving, or there's holes, or there's not teachers to cover certain classes. And so when families get wind of this, oh, my child doesn't even have a teacher who knows this material. That's biology, but I got someone who never taught science before teaching my child. I'm going to go put them in a school where they have that opportunity. And so how do you get ahead of that? How do you retain and attract the talent that you need so that those holes don't happen? But a lot of it starts with the culture that you create in your school.
Yeah, such a good point on how much culture impacts enrollment and retention. Because ultimately, if you're not, creating a culture that's serving students and your school leaders, it's going to reflect in what people say about your school and the community, and that's going to affect enrollment trends for the future. One of the questions around just funding challenges for school that often comes up is and you touched on this a little bit a moment ago, but how can school leaders and teachers work together to ensure that the resources that are at the school are being used efficiently to work and support student achievement and teacher development? What can they do as a team to help make that happen?
Right. I think it's the leader's job. Again, I go back to collective teacher advocacy. How do you make teachers a part of the process? How do you get them to buy in? How do you give them a say? How do you make sure you're transparent with the budget? How do you, and a lot of things that I like to work with leaders on is asking more questions and having more answers, right? And so as leaders, we often want to come up with the solutions, but don't deeply understand the problem. And so asking a lot of questions and starting to think in the term of questions, and asking these questions with your staff and bringing them in to be a part of the process, bringing them in to be on the committee, to understand budget and finance, to have a say-so or a voice, but also understanding, what does this community need? So if this community looking at for example, thinking about like workforce development, right? And thinking about, hey, does this community have a high success rate? So there's opportunity for welders, and they're bringing windmills in, and they're paying $85 an hour to do that. How can I start building in that STEAM or that STEM and workforce development in our programming, but being forward thinking to use our resources and the right opportunities to build a conglomerate that is successful for kids? But it starts with making the different stakeholders a part of your process.
Yeah, for sure. I want to turn to facilities for a second, just because that's a huge hurdle. I know,
Right.
particularly for whether you're, a startup school, whether you're maturing and growing, facilities is always becomes, potentially one of the biggest barriers to growth for schools. What do you think about, what's the current view you have on the landscape for purchasing or leasing school buildings? What's working, what's not? Just some thoughts on, as schools look for new places to call their home and evolve, what are the challenges they're facing when it comes to purchasing or leasing a
Oh,
space?
oh man, it starts with the funding issues, right? And so when I think about this, where I'm at in Rochester, New York, Rochester schools receive 58 cents on the dollar. I think the average what gross schools quoted in another meeting with you guys was 81 cents on the dollar for charter schools. So when places are receiving less money, even 81 cents isn't 100%, right? But now 58 cents on the dollar, and it starts with our leadership trying to involve parents, trying to involve the school community to start changing the narrative and getting the voices of the people to start changing and working to get legislatures to see the need to not have, like in Rochester, the legislatures, the way they're voting, they're basically saying that our charter school kids are worth 3/5 of a person.
Mm-hmm.
And 3/5 of a person, that's some heavy language that's been utilized in some things that we all have heard before. And it has a lot to do with slave talk, unfortunately. And typically 90% throughout the country of charter schools are in Black and brown areas.
Yep.
And in low income areas, it seems like, and it feels like a revolving cycle that needs to change. So I think part of it is we change it by getting the voices of the people involved, building awareness that this is a huge issue. And then as we do that, just thinking about the funding and utilizing it adequately. So if you have a choice or an option, it's always better to, I would say, to own, if you can find low interest loans or bonds, and be able to own your property or work with companies like Grow Schools, like, shameless plug, right? But work with Grow Schools and other companies that are out there to be able to own your own facility, because as you own your own facility, you have the opportunity to invest in it and change it. Like I moved facilities. We started off with a facility at one point in time that was like, it was such a bad deal. I don't even know how the leader before me negotiated that deal, but it might have been the only option he had. So it's hard to judge it. But they were paying for a building that was almost, I think about maybe 40,000 square feet. They were paying almost $900,000 a year. And so it was breaking and killing the budget. And that was a lease. And there was no shot at ownership, or none of that money was going towards ownership. And so there wasn't even investing a lot of money into the building outside of maintenance, didn't make a lot of sense. So we ended up finding a building, which sometimes the resources are scarce. We found an 84,000 square foot building that we were able to build our credit in the process. We were able to do some other things. We did some renovation, and we ended up purchasing this building. We did a lease to purchase where we started off, I think, for $5 million. I think we leased for 5 years. That money came off the purchase price. And so we ended up finally buying the building with 18 acres for $3.2 million at the end of it all, as what we ended up financing over the course of maybe 10 years. I think 5 years, I want to say almost 8 years are gone already. And so now the school, and I'm not there anymore, but that school will end up owning it and 18 acres, and everything that was improved ended up changing and making a staple of the community, and end up going back to your other questions, making it very attractive for kids. Like we built a music production studio, construction tech lab, a full barber shop, a game design lab. We built things that would make kids want to choose this as a school, that it would be more attractive than any other school in the area if they fit because it was all boys school, if they fit the requirements to come to the school, which that was, the gender requirement was, it was a single sex school.
Yeah. Just such good points there. I think you nailed it on a couple of things, is looking for flexibility as you grow inside of whatever facilities opportunity. Certainly ownership and control over your space is important as you grow as well. You mentioned us as an option. There's a lot of great options out there for schools to consider, whether it's a bank, a bond. There are both for-profit and nonprofit options. There's a variety of funding paths for school leaders to consider. And often it's a mix of those, right? We're not only going to be the silver bullet, as they say proverbially,
Right.
but, big challenges you noted, just the amount of funding that charter schools are getting comparatively to their school districts that are not a charter school. is something that's getting quite challenging, whether you're looking in the New York market where you may be or other states as well. So something that's definitely going to have to get resolved at the state, national, and local level as we think about how we evolve and make funding equitable for all different types of schools. I want to ask you one more question because we're hitting that almost 15-minute mark here. But one last question on just running schools effectively. Financial resources become the way that school leaders can be secure and sustainable in the growth of their schools. And there's obviously a lot of different ways that states compensate schools, based on attendance and whatnot. But how do you see the current funding landscape impacting charter schools' ability to run effectively? Are there certain things that we could be doing, at the local, federal, or state level that could help create more sustainable financial resources for schools?
Yeah, I think it's going to go back to thinking about it from a standpoint of we're not receiving that, at least across the country, but specifically in New York, we're not receiving the amount of money that we really should. Your child is worth the full amount. When your child goes to get their education, they should be getting the full amount, but they're not, and they're often not because of larger entities that don't want the money to leave their pot. Yeah. And so when we think about it, I just try to put it in layman's terms as much as possible, but many miss or people have issues with charter schools because they say they're taking from our bottom line, they're stealing our kids. No, what they're doing is providing a choice and an option, and it may be a better choice and it may not. Each child is an individual, but why wouldn't that money follow that child, and why wouldn't they get 100% of those funds? And it really has to do with our lawmakers. And so as a school, thinking about it from the standpoint of, if I had a failing business and I was going to, and not failing from results, but failing from money, right? I would probably do everything I can. I would scratch, claw, fight for every dollar. I would advocate, I would lobby, I would do whatever I needed to do. And I would make that my priority. The same thing for your charter schools. How do you mobilize the community? How do you build advocacy? How do you, and we can always talk about those things and what that looks like, but starting to build this unity and collaboration amongst the schools and networks to get our lawmakers to see that it's really not, that we need to stop trying to make a dollar out of 58 cents, and we need to really try to do things differently and change the mindsets of our lawmakers. But a lot of them, again, transparently, won't vote that way currently because they're supported by, like in New York State, unions who are, there's some campaigns where the unions are their main funders. And so they're going to align regardless of what's right. So when do we stop doing what's good for a dollar and doing what's right? And doing what's right is giving kids the opportunity to be educated in a successful environment where they have a choice. Because and I look at this and I'll close out just with a lot of charter schools. Often when you think about schools, they often are options because the Black and brown communities financially, and looking at some of the economic issues with this, they don't have the ability to put their children in private school, or they can't afford to homeschool because they're working 2 or 3 jobs, or they can't move to a suburb where the first thing a middle-class person says is, how's the school district? That's why you buy a house there. They can't do that. So what happens is, by default, they end up in a district school. If it's doing well, amen, hallelujah. But in a lot of cases, district schools aren't doing well and they're failing. And now you're arguing that you don't have a choice. Charter schools give you the choice. We need to start looking at it like that and doing what's best for kids and putting the funding where it needs to go. That's with our kids.
Yeah, Dr. Miller, right there. Some absolute hard truths that everyone needs to hear. It is no secret that the way that our per pupil funding in the U.S. is not equitable at all. It's based on your zip code, where you live, versus you being an individual and getting the same payout that every other kid across the country gets. And certainly charter schools provide that choice to ensure that there are options that are hopefully more impactful for different populations out there. So absolute truths coming from you today, Dr. Miller. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I love it. I love it.
For sure. Well, hey, we're right at that almost 20-minute mark. It's been a great conversation. We always appreciate having robust conversations here on Tuesday Tips. Again, we're here every Tuesday, usually about the 10 a.m. Pacific time, 1 p.m. Eastern time. I just want to say a big thank you to Dr. Paul Miller for joining us from Rochester Charter Champions. We'll have to have you back, and maybe we'll have you back on some of the topics we've talked about, advocacy at the local level, particularly from as we look to an election in a few weeks, where it's going to be important that we make choices of political leaders that have the best interests of our kids and our communities at hand. So maybe we'll have you back as we get towards that November 4th date to talk about. We'll definitely send that invitation soon. With that said, we'll say goodbye. And again, big thanks to Dr. Miller. We'll see you all next week right here on the Grow Schools channel. Take care.